Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Telit-led webinar, Pandemic Disaster Recovery, COVID-19 IIoT Use Cases. I'm Lindsay Kelly, Vice President of Digital and Content Marketing here at Telit, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Before we start, we'd like to gauge an idea of your role or function in the adoption of secure access systems for manufacturing infrastructure. So I'm going to drop a poll for everyone. If you could please take just a moment, answer that for us. And I'll give you guys just a few moments while I speak a little bit about our two presenters today. So today I'm pleased to be joined by Fred Jens. He is the President of Strategic Partnerships here at Telit, and also by Stuart Perry. Stuart is our Vice President of secureWISE Engineering at Telit. I'm going to leave that poll up for just another moment or two, but have a couple of announcements here. Before I hand it over to Fred to start with our presentation, I have a few quick reminders. I would like to encourage everyone in our audience to please interact by posting questions. If you look just to the right of your presentation screen, you'll see a couple of tabs, and there's one up there where you can post a question, and we'll have some time to answer those at the end of the presentation today. So please keep those coming throughout the entire presentation. We'll get to those at the end. And I'm going to go ahead and gather those poll results now, and thank you all for answering those for us. And with that, Fred, I am going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So my name is Fred Jens, and I'm going to take you through a few things here on the topic. And I want this presentation to be, one, informative, two, a little bit provocative, and make us think about some questions that we might all face going forward. At the beginning, I just want to set the stage. This is really a presentation about, Industry 4.0, remote services, Industry IIO or Industry IoT adoption. And we're going to focus on a couple of cases, but most of all, we're going to focus on the semiconductor manufacturing case. We've got some very unique data and some information to share with you on this, and I think it's maybe one of the most provocative topics that we could hit on this journey. One of the things we're going to talk about, as the title says, is COVID-19 and this pandemic. How do external forces affect or accelerate user behavior of some of these services? I think there's been some resistance in the past. We'll talk about that. When we think about these services, again, remote access, e-Diagnostics, this collection of really killer apps, we want to look at how they move through their product and adoption evolution. At one time they weren't possible, and then it was maybe a nice to have or should have. And sometimes things move quicker than we would like into what we'll call the must-have status. And we'll take a peek at that journey. And then, I'm going to stop. I'm going to really let Stuart take you through, what are we talking about in terms of the features, the details, some of the use cases of how this is used for both the fab and the tool maker or the factory side, as well as the tool provider, the tool OEM. And then final thoughts. I want to leave you with some questions that we can talk about, and we'll end early, and Lindsay will be able to moderate. We'll have some great Q&A time. So with that, I want to just lead in with what I will generically call the Telit secureWISE high-level value propositions. And this is just this is our product, but this is any e-Diagnostics remote access type service. There's some key elements like availability of the systems and solutions. If you're a factory owner, on the left side, you want to make sure that your equipment is up and running, that you have accessed by your suppliers to make sure that the equipment is up and running and functioning the best possible it could be. If you're a tool maker on the right side, you need to make sure that you can deliver those types of enhanced services. It's got to be secure. Both parties care. Both parties have access and IP that might concern them. So you need to really have an industrial-grade, auditable, secure system. Reduce costs. You don't do this unless you can increase output, reduce cost, ultimately improve the ROI. There's installations, there's in warranty, out of warranty. There's all kinds of things that you would put in kind of the value bucket why you do these kinds of services. And then what happens? Well, we had this external force. these are what I would say the architected planned use cases. But when we look at COVID and how it came upon us at the beginning of the year, there's a whole issue around what I'll call business continuity. And that's what I think we're going to explore as we go through some curves and some adoption rates and what I'll generically call a won't, could, should, and must matrix. And this is kind of a common way to look at the world when you're taking a look at services or products or things that consumers or businesses might adopt. So if we take this chart and I overlay some data, there's going to be a slide that you'll see in Stuart's presentation a little later that generally talks about adoption. This is some adoption between 2009 and 2020. Now, I've shrunk that and put it on there, and I'm going to overlay kind of a curve that we fit to this that really talks about when this type of a service was created. So back really in the late 90s, this was a service that was in standardization work. It was emerging. Clearly, it wasn't even available, so it would have fallen in the won't or can't kind of a category. So as we moved through the 2000 mark and we started the new millennium, the service moved up and through kind of what I will call the could implement, in that it grew and grew, and we started seeing some tool makers and fabs really turn this into a should-have feature as they deployed new tools, new assets, in order to deliver the kind of service that they demanded and their customers demanded. It moved into a should-have category. And then this strange event hit us in 2020. And the COVID pandemic created all kinds of issues around travel restrictions, safety, issues around access, physical access. And what we saw an exponential jump in some of the services that we offer that we are going to talk to you about, to talk about kind of the disaster recovery element of this. Now, the real question, I think, where it starts to get interesting is we've kind of reached this new elevated peak, and everybody's going to start to ask, what's next? Have we changed the usage? Have we changed the adoption? Are we going to keep that high level of usage for remote services? I know many of us who travel a lot for a living or go to an office, we're thinking about changing a lot of our behavior as we relied more and more on things like Zoom and Teams and other remote access and remote collaboration tools. Is that going to be the same for Industry 4.0 and manufacturing? Or do you think we're going to come back down to maybe a should-use level and still, or somewhere in between? So this is kind of the high-level thought, and we'll dig in more and more into this. But at the end of the day, and at the end of this presentation, what I really want to talk through and have some feedback from the audience is, some questions that we can ask ourselves. How did the user or owner adoption change? Is the ROI better understood today than it was potentially before COVID? Will usage return to a should-have level, or will it stay at the must-have levels that we've seen in the last several months? And will this become a must-have feature? Because we can no longer say, oh, that'll never happen. We've just been through and are continuing to go through this pandemic experience in terms of how we're dealing with, social distancing, remediation, travel restrictions, etc. So, is this, I don't want to say it's a new normal, but what will kind of the new normal be? And how do we as business owners, tool makers, factory owners, or technology suppliers have to think about the services available to you and whether they're required for a disaster recovery planning component of your continuity plan, or are they just going to fall back down to something that is very important but not necessarily must-have? So before we go any further on some of these provocative questions, this was a great setup, I hope, for Stuart to take us through what kind of services are we talking about, what kind of architecture and solutions will you see offered through the secureWISE service use. So Stuart, I will leave it to you now, and I'll go on mute so that you have full stage.
All right, thank you, Fred, and welcome everyone. Today I'll be talking about the secureWISE platform in general. Please remember to submit your questions as you think of them. Today's session is best if we get a lot of questions and interactive discussion after the presentation. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about what is secureWISE, what problems secureWISE addresses, kind of secure remote connectivity technology that we use, a quick overview of the architecture, and then we'll discuss the value drivers to both the fab and the OEM. So let's get started. All right, and Telit in general. So the secureWISE platform is important to note here that we're at 99% of the 300mm factories around the world. We're actually at 100% of all production. There's just one that we're not, which is not actually a production fab. So it's a huge footprint in the industry. We are the largest in the world. As far as tools we've connected to, we have over 250 tool types. So that means the tools that you want to connect are already in our library and ready to go. We are ISO 27001 certified from a security point of view. We've been at this for over 15 years. While COVID is a relatively new event, we started this endeavor back in 2002, and we've been slowly gaining trust of both OEMs and the fabs. So while we've been at this a long time and COVID is a relatively new thing, we will be here in the future continuing to provide this kind of service. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about our infrastructure now. And before secureWISE came along, the idea of connectivity meant VPN connectivity between suppliers and factories. And once you roll that out, you can see it begins to be a bit of a spaghetti bowl. You have a lot of maintenance from OEM and fab side to maintain all of those connections. In fact, in the late 90s, one of the OEM customers that had implemented this themselves had 3 dedicated IT people just to manage all of the IPsec connections around the world. We saw it as an opportunity to help minimize the cost of maintaining this kind of infrastructure while keeping the infrastructure itself secure and isolating it from the internet. So today, in the secureWISE solution, we have this type of architecture. Both, excuse me, OEMs on the top, as well as fabs, ICMs on the bottom, all have one connection into what we call ServiceNet. So Telit, secureWISE, basically manages the complexity of all the communication between OEMs and ICMs. And we do this through hub and spoke IPsec VPN configuration. What this means is that if OEM A needs access to Fab A, we can specifically dictate only those communications are available, even though there may be other fabs or ICMs on our network. So it gives the fabs a level of security knowing that only OEMs that have been authorized to connect to their factories can do so. And right now we're just focusing on network connectivity point of view. And a little bit later in the presentation, we'll talk about how the fabs then take that information and turn it into, from a business point of view, what can be allowed to the OEM. So we support multiple on-ramps into this infrastructure. So if an OEM, let's say, has a support organization in Taiwan and Korea and in Texas, those 3 on-ramps will provide access to the infrastructure. That'll make sure that if they're servicing local fabs, that they get a good response. and they don't have to go from corporate to our infrastructure halfway around the world and back to somewhere that might be down the street. So secureWISE is really the most secure way to remotely access, monitor, and mediate equipment. And this is primarily because of the ServiceNet infrastructure. So everything that you see and hear about today is not available on the open internet. You can't open your browser and access our infrastructure, and neither can the bad guys. So our only customers that are registered customers, Telit, secureWISE, have access to this infrastructure. We have very strict protocols to make sure that the people on the other end of these VPNs are who they say they are, and we have secrets kept between the companies so we know that that is an authenticated connection. And again, this is just from a networking point of view. So this provides a secure, configurable, end-to-end connectivity solution from networks. So this allows equipment owners and equipment builders to remotely collaborate in ways to improve equipment performance at every stage of the process. You know, everything from tool install to after warranty service. So this picture just shows what this infrastructure looks like. So we have 5 hubs around the world. We have one in the US, one in UK, one in China, Japan, and Taiwan. Now this infrastructure is constantly evolving and improving. As we see bottlenecks in certain geographic regions, we add more hubs, we increase bandwidth. We do all those things that if you were managing this yourself as an OEM or fab, you would have to take care of and do. But we do all that, automatically for you. COVID is a good example of this. Our traffic volumes have increased substantially over the past 2 months. But none of our customers, either fabs or OEMs, had to do anything to adjust for that volume of traffic. We did everything in our infrastructure. We made all the changes, moved all the dials so that the customers continued to get a good performance, even though there was a lot more traffic on the line. Another thing that's important here is this is a multi-tenant architecture. So all OEMs and all fabs reside on this private network. And you'll see in a little bit, there's also a component that resides in the factory that also is multi-tenant, and that allows kind of a landing point for the OEMs when needing to address the fab, as well as the single pane of glass that's used by the factory to administer and control access to intellectual property inside of the factory. All right, so this drills down a little bit more. Instead of the network that we've talked about is represented in that center box called Telit secureWISE ServiceNet. We'll talk now a little bit about the right-hand side and then do a deeper dive into the factory as well as the capabilities that we provide. So on the OEM side, there can be from 1 to a number of connections from a specific OEM into our infrastructure. This is all managed by IT when the system is initially set up. We also have kind of a lightweight version to connect for those smaller OEMs or for people who are constantly on the road and don't necessarily have, let's say, a home office where they always connect. So we have multiple options there to allow us OEMs to access the infrastructure. Now, on the ICM side, or the fab side, there is a very critical piece of equipment that's installed in every single fab around the world, 300 millimeter fabs and about 50% of the 200 millimeter, which is called the secureWISE server. And that acts as landing spot for all of the OEMs to access the information that's accessible within the factory. And not only, do OEMs use this service and access the secureWISE server, we have many fabs that need to control access to their own data. And thus, fab employees use this same service within the four walls of the factory or from home, connecting to the fab's network to access tool information. And you'll see that in some of our use cases. So this secureWISE server is a dedicated piece of hardware, multi-tenant. All of the customer from a fab point of view and OEM are registered on that server. And when a new OEM needs access a specific piece of equipment in a factory, there's a process that we go through to basically have them onboarded to the secureWISE server to review what access privileges, roles, responsibilities are going to be allowed for access to the equipment. And once all that's agreed upon, it's basically configured in the secureWISE server by either a Telit support engineer when authorized by the fab or by a fab administrator themselves. So the nice thing about this is you don't need to call somebody in IT to go open port 21 or 22 to the tool because you need vendor A to come in. It's all configured through a very easy to use web interface that allows kind of business rules or business access as opposed to worrying about ports and protocols and all those kinds of messy things. You're more concerned with, I want this OEM to be able to access their log files on the equipment, and they can't pull anything else. And, they can only read them. They're not allowed to replace anything on the equipment. They're not allowed to delete files, etc. So we kind of position this as an application layer firewall. So instead of dealing with ports protocols, which IT people usually understand, we're dealing with applications like moving files, like viewing the front screen of the equipment, like remotely accessing commands on the equipment. So now we'll talk a little bit about the capabilities that we provide within secureWISE. We'll first start out with FTP. So that allows files to be transferred either to or from the equipment in a controlled fashion. Again, this is set up, pre-authorized by the factory, available 24/7, so that if you either want to follow a break-fix model, tool goes down, you use secureWISE to access the equipment, or more of a predictive maintenance point of view, where you want to collect data daily, hourly, every minute on the equipment's performance, analyze that, and provide information back to the fab. Now, an important thing that happens here is you're talking about enterprise-to-enterprise connectivity. There's always a risk that someone sends a file that has a virus in it from from either the fab or OEM point of view. So one unique thing that the secureWISE server does is it does something called port protocol translation, which means that the OEM on the right never has direct access to anything on the left as far as the tool is concerned. Everything is checked, verified, double-checked within the secureWISE server to make sure that person's authorized to do that and that they're actually doing something, from an application level that's allowed. In addition to that, we also keep a complete audit log of everything that the user does. So if they access a file to copy it, if they review the console of the tool, they visit a web page on a specific tool, all of that information is recorded in the secureWISE server and stored on the secureWISE server staging area. So let's say someone wants to visit a web page on the tool. We virus check the contents of that web page, as well as any attachments that they may be transferring through the system, assuming they're allowed to do so. The same goes for file transfer. We make sure that the files and data that goes through the system does not contain any viruses. We've actually had instances in the past where either the fab or the OEM, unfortunately, has been compromised. And the worst thing you could do is either have your supplier or your customer infected by an event at your company. So secureWISE makes sure that that accidental, let's say, infection is not going to happen through our system. All right, we'll talk a little bit about remote tool operation. This allows you to view the front console or any internal computer inside of the equipment. By default, you can only view. There are special safety protocols that we've implemented that have been implemented by the OEMs so that, let's say, if someone needs to control the equipment or already has control of the equipment and if an unsafe event occurs, let's say they're remotely controlling the equipment and somebody opens the door to the equipment. At that point, the equipment will send a signal to secureWISE, and we will automatically remove the active control of the equipment and put the remote user back into view mode. So it's a huge safety advantage in using our system to make sure that someone isn't injured while remote control is being used. We also have authorization interfaces so that, let's say, only certain people within the factory are authorized to permit active control or even view. Those can be configured with the system very easily. So in general, it provides a very flexible, easy to use, safe, secure environment to be able to look at what the equipment is doing, assist the person in the fab, or collaborate with many users all watching the front panel of the tool to see what's going on. The next capability is remote application access. This uses something called SSH, which is a protocol, but instead of giving the OEM user a terminal, we give the user a list of pre-authorized commands. So they might want to check the size of the disk. So they'll see a command that says check size of disk. They'll select it. We will then interpret that command to its SSH equivalent, capture the information, log it, and return it back to the end user. So it makes actually managing equipment very, very easy because you don't have to remember, does there a dash go here or a dot? It's all pre-programmed into the system. If you need to add arguments, for example, a file name, you can simply select the file, select the command, and the command will be issued. We actually use this quite heavily in supporting the secureWISE infrastructure. So we've already defined a set of commands that different levels of support are allowed to use within each secureWISE server. So it minimizes any kind of errors or somebody accidentally types in a wrong command and causes harm to the system. And again, because it's all audit logged, if there is an issue, we can always go back into the audit log, determine where the issue occurred, and correct it. And in fact, in some cases where fabs have, kind of joint responsibility with OEMs, secureWISE has ended up being an arbiter between the two, where there isn't a clear delineation as far as who performed the act on the tool. The fabs routinely ask us for information on what transpired between point A to point B. They're also able to do that themselves, but it's obviously much easier to send us a note and ask the information. For a kind of newer technology, we have HTTP access. So if a tool or server has a web server on it, we can provide access to that web server from outside of the factory, even though the web server may not have been designed to do that type of thing. We can also, in a very granular fashion, say, oh, you can only see page A, B, and C, but nothing else on that web server. We also have the ability to keyword scan that web traffic. So if the fab wants to make sure that, let's say, specific tool IDs or recipe numbers are not contained in any of the web traffic, they can input that information into the secureWISE server, and if that is detected, then it will immediately halt access to that required web page. Another popular service is RDP for those Windows users. So we allow a controlled access through RTP to the equipment and the factory. And we do that by making sure that things like copy, paste, print access, disks, etc., are inoperable through the RDP connection. So it makes it a much better, a tighter experience from the fab's point of view, because they know that users cannot use that link to transfer data. They're forced to use the controlled file transfer capability that allows you to segregate different directories, different capabilities, and roles, etc. And then finally, we have something called port forwarding, which is really meant for legacy applications that were created long before the internet that might need a database port open to access the equipment, or some SexGem port. We can use that service to give the OEM user access to that equipment data. All right, so I've kind of summarized the capabilities within secureWISE as far as the basic. I'm going to touch a little bit on some more advanced features just to give everybody an idea of what happens when you want to roll this solution out to an enterprise, right? You don't want to just connect to one or two fabs. You want to connect to all of your customers, and you don't have a few engineers that you want to use this. You have hundreds or thousands. So to help manage that kind of environment, we have the capability for the secureWISE server that's located in the fab or hosted at the OEM to interface with the company's enterprise system through something called SAML2. So what that really means at a high level is if I'm an OEM and I have a secureWISE server that I use as a gateway to the rest of the infrastructure, I never have to log in. My IT systems already know who I am because I'm logged into a laptop, and secureWISE is securely connected into my company's IT system. So I just launch the application, select where I want to go, and I'm in business. So it really makes accessing, hundreds of sites very, very simple. So that really helps manage the system when you have hundreds or thousands of users, as well as factories that you're connecting to. Now, many customers start out with a break-fix model, right? They have specific customers that have a need. They're installing a new tool type, first gen in the world, obviously needs lots of TLC. Oh, we need remote connectivity to be able to support that. So that works out well. Then they talk about, oh, well, we kind of need to install some patches here and there because of problems we found. We end up doing that. And then once the tool is finally in service and reliable, then you want to start learning from that install base. And that's where a component we call SSCE comes into play that allows OEMs to start to collect information across their entire tool base around the world. And using the same exact methodology, whether it's a time-based or event-based, they can collect tool information or whatever they need and bring that back home, bring it into big data systems, do an analysis on that. And many of our own customers actually take that information, regurgitate it, provide value on top of that, and send reports back to the factory to help the factory improve productivity. And you can imagine it's a very, very popular item for the fabs, because now they feel like the OEM, while not just selling them the equipment, is helping them improve it, make it better over time. And this obviously helps when it's time to buy more tools. Who are they going to think of first? The OEM that's currently supporting them and continuing to get more use out of the equipment that they have today. But then one last thing that we'll cover before we go on to the next slide is something called BMP. So that's the Business Management Portal. As you can imagine, all this information all over the world, you want to have a pulse of who's doing what, how much data is being transferred, when is it happening, how many people are transferring files versus RTOing to the tool, what percentage of people use RTO versus file transfer. Those are all very important questions when you're talking about manager field support organization, so that you as a OEM developing more capabilities on your tool, if you notice that most of the information or services that are being used are RTO, you're going to focus more on that capability, its performance, more things that you can provide to your support engineers to provide better service to your end customers. So this shows how the multi-tenant portion of the secureWISE server works. You can see in the center there the secureWISE server in the fab. All of the different OEMs come in through ServiceNet, each represented by different colored dots. And while they all land at the same secureWISE server, they only see the information they're allowed to see. So if OEM 1, there's just one tool there, that's the only tool that they see on their software. Even though there might be hundreds or thousands of tools connected within that factory, they only see the ones that they're allowed access to. So it serves several purposes. One, reduces the clutter for the OEM engineer. They only get to see what they have access to. And from a fab point of view, it reduces visibility of the equipment inside of the factory. And because we obscure the tools and the networks they're on and their actual location, fabs are free to move those pieces of equipment around the factory to different locations, different areas, different subnets, without the end user OEM ever knowing it's happening. They just see a logical entity on the screen. They need file X, they download it. They have no idea what was needed to actually get that file from that tool through the secureWISE infrastructure inside of the fab to ServiceNet and finally to their laptop. So key value adds, obviously maximizing uptime is critical for equipment. Given the cost of equipment nowadays going up and up, fabs want to make sure they utilize that capital equipment as well as possible. And because of the complexity, OEMs really have to be involved to make that happen. Machine owners and builders really need to collaborate to make that happen. One really can't solve the equation without the assistance of the other. Fred mentioned this a little earlier in the presentation, intellectual property. Most people think about intellectual property from a fab point of view, but almost all OEMs have intellectual property also. How do they service their tools? What is their secret sauce in making that equipment work? So they need to isolate and compartmentalize that information from their customers. Again, got to have a secure way to do this and an agreed upon platform. It doesn't do any good for you to buy into a platform that's only installed into a few fabs. It'll be decades before you have all your customers connected. You need to go with an infrastructure that already has the base foundation out there and ready to use. So Fred already touched on these standard capabilities. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions at the end. So this gives you a general idea of what our usage has been over the years, from the nice to have to must have categories. You can see it's generally upticked. We expect this number to actually go up 10x over the next 3 to 5 years. As I said before, we're ISO certified. We also hire companies like SYSS to do independent penetration tests of our software. Fabs constantly do penetration tests of our equipment and software. They obviously have a vested interest in the platform, believe that it's secure, but they always verify. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Fred.
All right. Thanks, Stuart. Great job. So I am just going to take you through a couple of things here. As you saw, Stuart talked about some use cases around like RTO, remote terminal operations. When we look through the optics of connecting in an isolated world, and this external event or this issue that we came upon, as we all know, and this is a backdated. Unfortunately, these aren't the numbers today, but this is a very backdated slide of the dashboard for the COVID coronavirus dashboard by Johns Hopkins that I think probably everybody has seen. This was going on at the time that we're looking at all this. So when you can't travel, when you can't enter a factory to repair or manage the installation of your machines, what happens? And what are some of these use cases that we kind of generically talked about in terms of business continuity? And here I want to just touch on, if you have to operate your factory because you have forced a reduced on-site staff, and why would you have maybe done that? Some of our customers in the factory or the fab ownership model reduced the number of total people on site to reduce the threat surfaces for the risk of the virus transmission. So they had to have people work at home. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that if for those of you who don't know, shutting down the fab is not an option, right? Critical industry for the world. So it was, how do we keep operating at full capacity without infecting or causing issue with our employees?
Exactly. So when we think of viruses, normally we were always concerned about air gaps on IP networks and remote access and viruses, meaning the IT type. But in this case, the world pivoted to the virus of the corona type. And we had to reduce the number of people that were allowed into the fabs or into the clean rooms. So it really became, a disaster recovery and a business continuity tool to keep these fabs operating at 100% or near 100% with a far reduced load of people inside doing the work. So these people were doing the work from the outside. Now, if we're a tool maker and I'm in Silicon Valley, but I have tools deployed in mainland China, or I have tools deployed in Europe or across the U.S. When travel is stopped and you absolutely cannot remotely arrive to the location, walk into the fab, do your clearance, and support your customer, you still have to manage your SLAs. So managing the SLAs in an environment where the factory's never shut down, but you can't get in to work on them is very, very important. So that became a disaster recovery or business continuity use case. And finally, there were tools, and these are very expensive tools. These are very expensive machines. When they're in process of being installed, getting them installed, commissioned, and up and running is a critical event in the delivery of these tools. So making sure that you can continue to deliver and deploy and monitor these tools at the installation time was also seen as very, very important. Now, one of the graphs I want to show you next is the usage of our RTO service. So this is anonymized service for some of our key customers put together, and you can see, and it's a small chart of the numbers, but there's the total number of sessions and the average duration of a session. So frequently our sessions would be somebody going in quickly to check on something on an as-needed basis. But what happened is the session duration went off the charts, and that's because people were either off-site logged in and operating and managing the tool throughout the shift or through very long periods of time. So this radical jump that we saw as the coronavirus hit, and this is basically, the month that things started to close down, is the curve that I really talked about at the very, very beginning of this discussion. Now, the real question is, let's look at some of these key use cases around the virus. So, Stuart, just go ahead and take it from here and do a couple of slides to talk about, what were these use cases and how did they apply?
All right. Thank you, Fred. So in this particular case, before virus, either process engineers inside the factory, either OEM or factory-based, would daily go to the equipment, usually use a USB stick or some other form of transport, and collect data from all the equipment within the factory. Do this every day. As soon as they get into work, as soon as they were finished collecting the information, they would then take that information, analyze it, determine the tasks needed for the day, what equipment was down, what needed to be serviced, basically come up with their plans for the rest of the day or week based on the information they collected. Then the virus hits, and they're no longer allowed to access the factory. So they had to quickly retool and figure out a way to get that information so they can still perform their jobs. So instead of walking the factory floor, picking up information, they automated that entire system using the scheduler server. So they quickly defined what tools they wanted to access, what information they wanted to get, how often they wanted to get it, and started the system. So what happened, instead of taking an hour and a half every morning collecting this information, now they could stay at their office, whether that's in the fab or at the OEM, either local service center or remote, and as soon as they walk in the door, immediately providing that value, looking at what problems are there, where do I need to focus my attention, and take care of the customer. Now, some benefits from this approach, not only not needing to go to the fab, gown up anymore, was that the USB sticks went out the door. So all the data that was transferred off the equipment now was virus checked. USBs didn't go in and out of the factory. There was much more control of intellectual property coming off that tool. While you trust your employees and your service providers, it's better to have a system that enforces that what data can be collected. It basically saved 90% of the time needed to collect and disseminate the information. And key for the virus was clean room access was no longer needed. Okay, the next example is a specific case, a metrology tool had a hard fail and because of a power issue, and the engineers couldn't get to the fab. So if you're not able to catch that quickly, it can take up to 5 days to typically recover and set up the vacuum, et cetera, inside of that equipment. So obviously with the virus in play, they couldn't just get in their car and go address the issue. So they contacted the fab, said, hey, we need access. They said, the only way you can do that now is through secureWISE. So they got connected to the system, connected to the equipment, and basically started that process of recovery long before it hit the point where it was going to take 5 days to address the issue. So because this service was available in the fab, it was a simple flip the switch, adding of a session, adding of a user to allow the user to start servicing that equipment and to get it back online, saving days and days of downtime. So those are the two use cases that we've outlined for this meeting. As obviously quite a few more cases that have cropped up because of the environment that we're in today. But I think that gives you a good feel as far as how people are using the system in this type of environment. So I'll turn it back over to you, Fred.
Yeah, so I just want to close with one thing here. It's one thing that when we tell you what people say, it's better when we actually hear from some of the key customers. So this is just a glimpse of one of the emails that we received from one of the users. This is probably somebody that was working at home, and because we had the secureWISE service there, they could still do their jobs. They were still employed. They were still keeping their customers happy. So just a quick, during these crazy times, thank goodness secureWISE allowed us to work in our primary residence. So, we want to thank all the customers and the people who keep the service running. And that leads me to the end. And the end is where I think we need to open it up for some Q&A. And hopefully we were informative, and hopefully Stuart and I, allowed you to kind of better understand what the service does and, what would be the ROI of a service like this. And as we think about, our lives going forward in the world of production, manufacturing, Industry 4.0, not to mention our professional lives in terms of officing and group meetings and travel, what will the new normal be for the connected machines, the connected factories, and the connected workers in our industry? And with that, I will stop and say thank you for your time, and I will turn it back to our moderator, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Fred and Stuart. Amazing information. Really appreciate you guys sharing that with all of us today. And now we do have quite a few questions that have come in. Some are quite technical, so there's still time to ask questions. So continue to insert those into the question box. But really quickly, I do want to drop one last poll for everybody here. And that is, if you'd like to have one of our experts reach out to you, get more information, learn a little bit more about secureWISE, please respond to the poll and we'll have somebody reach out to you directly. I'll leave that up for another minute or two. And I'm going to turn it back over to Fred and Stuart as they go through some of these different questions. There's a lot that are, like I said, quite technical, so I'm going to let them divvy those up. So back to you guys.
Great.
Okay, I'll start out with the go ahead, Fred.
No, it's fine. Go for it, please.
All right. I'll start out with the first one, which I think is in my wheelhouse, which is secureWISE set up IT friendly? And yes, it is. It's not like setting up a WebEx or GoToMeeting where you have instant access. As I noted before, this is a private infrastructure, not available on the internet. So there is some requirement to interface with IT to set up these very secure pipes and connections between ourselves and either the OEM or the factory. But because we manage that entire infrastructure, we make it as simple as possible for either the fab or the OEM IT to adopt the solution.
Okay, great. There's another one that came in here, and I think it can be related to several of them. It says, can this technology be applied to remote monitoring of contract manufacturing locations? And the answer there, I think, is absolutely yes. Some of our fab customers are servicing fabless semiconductor companies. So they're a contract manufacturer for them to get their silicon built. So one of the use cases is, having your designer and your OEM reach into a contract manufacturing environment to actually watch a process go through its steps, whether it's a discrete manufacturing process or a semiconductor process. It kind of is independent. So for sure, this is a very broad technology. While it's mostly applied in this presentation to the semiconductor industry, it's clearly for any high-value manufacturing environment where there are multiple participants in the ecosystem, multiple networks and organizations that need to collaborate in a secure way. There's another one here that just quickly, it's a follow-on to that one, and I'll let it be after this to maybe catch the next one, Stuart. Is there use cases for mining or natural extraction of resources? So yes, we have actually done some unique work in like upstream oil and gas, where you have very distributed sites and solutions, and there's a another solution that we have that's very suited towards more telemetry-oriented environments. It's not as robust in many ways because you have so much IP in the high-value clean tech industry for secureWISE, but there are Telit offers solutions that are very similar for these and some discrete manufacturing processes. Back to you.
Okay, I'd like to add to your contract manufacturing question that you addressed, Fred. So, please. Not many people know this, but secureWISE is actually used within Telit to secure our contract manufacturing for our modules. And in fact, during COVID, we spun up a brand new manufacturing facility using primarily secureWISE as the touch point and communication device to that new factory.
Excellent point.
So I'll address the next question, which is fab administrator. I assume the question is, who is that? What role is that? Fab administrator is typically someone who is responsible or oversees the secureWISE server in the factory. They, in most cases, delegate that responsibility to the tool owner. So while they may manage and control the infrastructure from a responsibility point of view, let's say it's time to add OEM 1's tools to the fab, they'll delegate that authorization to the tool owner. Say, here's what the OEM would like to gather from the equipment, how often, the kind of services that they want to have available, and they work closely with the tool owner to provide that authorization. Again, every fab is different. Some fab administrators handle everything themselves. Some it's kind of a dual between the fab administrator or tool owner, or sometimes it's just tool owner. Very flexible system. And then the second part of that question was access to LDAP and interfacing to it. So yes, we do support that, and we do that through SAML 2. That is a kind of a higher level enterprise authentication system that is built on top of and available through most LDAP systems. Things like ADFS is a good example of that. But it's a web standard that allows enterprise-to-enterprise connectivity. So both fab employees can use that when they're accessing the secureWISE server. So the fab's ADFS or LDAP can be the primary source of authentication to the server, as well as the OEM. So we're uniquely positioned by organization, by company, to be able to determine what kind of authentication mechanism is used for that individual.
Stuart, why don't you take the one at the bottom there about the day-to-day operations outside of the machinery? Probably an OEM connector / SSE kind of a discussion. More OEM connector, I think, if you can see it.
Yeah, I'm reading it now. Excuse me.
While Stuart's reading that, I'm going to give everybody just one more moment to answer that poll, and then I'm going to go ahead and close that out as Stuart takes us home here.
All right. So to answer that question, as far as can it be extended to other day-to-day operations outside of the machinery? Absolutely. So we have capabilities like chat for messaging. We also have something called OEM Connector, which if an OEM support engineer is in the factory and the factory does not provide internet access or any way to get access to technical information, support systems, parts, knowledge base, etc., we can actually expose that information through our server for that field support engineer. And all of that is done through our secure networking infrastructure. So kind of think of it as a two-way communication channel that benefits both the fab and the OEM.
Excellent. Well, I was going to say, Fred, any final comments before we wrap it up here?
I want to just address one thing. There's been a couple of streams that touch on kind of two of our key projects, or products rather. Can secureWISE be used in conjunction with DeviceWISE and vice versa? So again, secureWISE is very much the secure interconnect collaboration services, where DeviceWise is really more focused on the endpoint and edge intelligence and integration inside the factories. So together, they are actually a fabulously matched pair. You might be connecting secureWISE to a DeviceWise enterprise node as an example in some of these questions. So they are used, they can be used independently or they can be used concurrently to reach different objectives. So, so thanks for all the questions. Back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, guys. We really appreciate all of your knowledge today, and thanks to our audience for joining us. Hope you found some valuable information. Check your inboxes in the coming days. We'll have the slides and the replay link coming to you. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.